Greetings, family. Today's topic is women and girls, the global struggle during Rona quarantine quarantine chronicles 2020, right? Because, fam, this has been an interesting adventure. And it's crazy because this week, I've just been seeing a lot of, kind of incidents being highlighted with regards to just how women and girls, not just women, right? Girls, how they're being treated across the world. It's crazy. It's crazy. Especially if we're sitting here and saying, as people are fighting for equity across the board, right? We are fighting for equity, which is literally a human right, right? And women and girls are still being mistreated. Now imagine on top of that to be a woman or a girl and to also be melanated and the experiences that come with that as well. Comes down to harassment and abuse against women and girls globally. We're seeing this crazy trend where women and girls are experiencing some very harsh conditions being put upon them by men, the males of our society. And we have to speak about it. So I'm going to use my platform also to shed light on it, because I talk about everything else. I shed light on everything else because at the end of the day, it's all about equity and justice for all, especially our marginalized demographics. So that's what we're going to do. Anywho, also with regards to Rona quarantine, one of the things we've seen is an increased cases of reporting of domestic violence and domestic abuse, and that's globally, right? We've seen this spike in domestic abuse and domestic violence towards women. If you're watching this and you're going through domestic abuse or domestic violence or child abuse and violence, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And please get help. And there's resources out there. You can check out harpnow.org or just like Google any domestic abuse assistance or advocacy groups that are local to you. Or reach out to harpnow.org. We usually, we can help try to point you in the right direction as well. Okay, so it's not only domestic abuse that we've seen rise, we're also seeing a rise in child abuse, right? And one of the most serious cases that I've been reading about is this issue with underage girls in Kenya who are falling ill. And on top of that, parents are finding out later that they're pregnant. We'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about that. Yeah. So we've seen this odd, like side effect of Rona quarantine, which is women and girls getting abused in the name of, protecting you, right? Police in some areas, in some countries are, really taking this quarantine enforcement thing a little too serious, a little too overboard. You're beating people, you're stomping people's heads on the ground, like you're beating them with like, it's sad, and again, they're doing this to men and women. And I'm not saying that you should, it's never okay to be beating anybody like that. It's crazy. Yeah? Especially if you're the one supposed to be keeping the peace, if you're the one supposed to be keeping order. Why are you acting so disorderly? As a policeman, your job is to ensure like safety and like make sure you have a good relationship with the community. And if you don't, then we need to reevaluate, well, what is your role and what is your role in the community? What is the role that you have envisioned in your mind of what your expectations are? And as a community, we need to come together and reconcile, right? This mismatch, this, confusion of expectations. because clearly what the people are expecting of you is not what's being delivered. So it's either you as a police officer, you need to change yourself, change your life, okay, or get out. Because I do not see any situation where it's okay for a police person to be beating up a woman or anybody. Like if you feel like they've broken a law, go ahead and arrest them and let them go through the due process to get justice. Yeah? If you see somebody breaking a law, come if it's curfew, right? And you're supposed to be enforcing, the COVID curfew. Okay, fine. Gather them, cite them, because you're not supposed to be interacting with them. You're not supposed to be touching people. You're not supposed to be, breaking that social distance. If you're beating them and bloodying them up, doesn't that make it worse in terms of transference of like germs or like putting their life in like higher risk? What sense does that make? So yeah, so we're seeing this increase of domestic abuse as well as child abuse, right? And no matter what it is, I'm like, there's no justification as to why that's okay. There's none. There's no way you're going to justify that for me. And then also, I read this article about how the Kenyan consulate in Lebanon is under investigation for what? Harassment and abuse towards women. You're overcharging them or, making sexually explicit remarks towards them. Just being problematic. And I'm like, if those are the people who are supposed to be your representatives in a foreign land, and you're going to them for help, right? You're going to them because ideally you're thinking that's the one person who can help you, and they're not being helpful. If anything, they're exacerbating your situation. Like, how is that supposed to be comforting to somebody who's already outside of their home country? We really need to rethink the people who we're putting into power, right? Because even here, we're in our voting season. And that's why I keep saying, brothers and sisters, we need to vote like our lives depend on it. Because for real though, our lives depend on this. Our parents' lives, our sisters' lives, our grandparents' lives, our children's lives, our nephews and nieces. If you don't have children, you don't want children. Like, it's not just about yourself. But even so, even you ought to want the best for yourself. You ought to want a safe life. A reasonable life at the very least. Going back to this situation that I mentioned earlier about these underage girls who are pregnant. And I believe some of them are as young as single-digit age. Think about that. That's your 8, 9 years old. Kids who are not 10 yet. In Kenya. I'm talking about Kenya. Even though I've also read some other articles and research by, what are they called? Human rights group. Where I believe Malawi has about 7,000 underage girls pregnant thus far. Apparently, the numbers, the last time I checked, it was over 150,000. 150,000 girls in Kenya are pregnant underage. What sense does that make? And then apparently in Machakos County alone, it was over 4,000 underage girls were pregnant. And apparently there are some of them are going through the process of litigating against the perpetrators. But that's just a drop in the bucket in comparison to the aggregate number of over 150,000 girls. That means they're under 18 who got pregnant during COVID. We understand, and underage pregnancies happen, but to have girls as young as single-digit, age out here pregnant during COVID quarantine, there's something deeper going on. We have to address the underlying issues here. We cannot pretend like, it's just, oopsies. No. Because I know, like, like in the past, right? We've talked about like, well, in my circle of friendships, we've talked about like the issues of like, oh, you know, I've seen even there's a documentary about, I think it was called Grades for Sex, where in like some educational institutions, the teachers were asking for sexual favors from the girls, from the students, in order to give them better grades or something, favors. Or the girls just felt coerced to do the sexual favors for the teachers in order for them to just pass, even though they were already doing the work. What sense does that make? I mean, and think about it. Like at the end of the day, that is simply an abuse of power. That is an obscene abuse of power. Like if you're the person in position, you know, to be in authority and power over somebody, that means then they can't even give you consent, really. They cannot consent to you like doing these kind of things to them. Who are these men or grown boys really who are getting these girls pregnant? Really, at this point, it's statutory rape. If we cannot establish true consent, but then again, also, what consent can a 8-year-old or 9-year-old give when it comes to sexual activity? What consent can an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, whoever, what real consent, what true consent can an 8-year-old or whatever, or preteen give with regards to sexual activity? First of all, like, what kind of education have they received on that? Because the other thing that we've got to talk about is what's the current state of sexual health education that they've received. You teach abstinence and you don't offer any kind of like true education on consent. Because I remember looking back, like, I'm not sure if like consent really is a core part of the discussion. If you are a sex ed person in Kenya or in Africa, is consent, comment in the comment section, is consent, even outside the context of sex, is consent a core part of the curriculum of the education? That's what I'd like to know. Let me know. Educate me. You know, is consent a core part of how you educate folks, or how you educate our young ones on bodily autonomy? Because clearly, for our girls in Kenya here, over 150,000 who are underage and pregnant, and 4,000 in Machakos County only, you know, what is the level of education and awareness on consent did they receive? And if whether they said yes or no, either way, I would say they're still too young to be able to truly consent to that kind of behavior. That means it was like imposed upon them. That means they experienced sexual assault. That means trauma, sexual trauma was inflicted upon them. That means somebody needs to be held accountable. And for me, it's like people are it's one thing to focus on the girls and say, oh, you know, this is what happened, and it's important to address that in full context. And on the flip side, also, we also can't just let the perpetrators just kind of skirt on by, because they think like that's for the longest time. I'm sure that's what they've counted on. It's like, oh, the girl will get pregnant, the family will take care of it, whatever. They'll just go on, you know, and deal with the effects of that. Well, the dude goes on to, you know, destroy another child's life. And I did say child. Destroy and, you know, and traumatize another child. Because that's lifelong, long-term trauma from sexual abuse and sexual assault. And half of these girls are not, you know, talking. They're not able to express. Because I'm like, do they even really have the language to express what happened to them? You have to have some issues with you for you to sit there and gain some sort of pleasure of abusing little girls. Something has got to be off for you to do that. But again, that's still not an excuse. You still need to be held accountable. And they need to be reported. There's people who are out here impregnating these girls, and you know, from what I'm reading, it's like they're buying them off with like candies or something. Yeah? Buying them off with sweets. Stupid little bribes. For what? For impacting their lives adversely for the rest of their life? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? That is sad. That is sad. My heart goes out to all them girls, because I mean, but also think about it like that. That it's like it has ramifications to society, right? Because now you have 150,000 underage girls, right, who have fallen pregnant. You know, you have to get prenatal care. You know, they have to figure out how to take care of these unborn children when they come. You know, when they're born. You know, many a times these girls come from, you know, not so wealthy families. It's like they're already struggling to begin with, and then you're adding on top of that this additional, you know, mouth to feed, this additional responsibility to take care of. And I'm like, how the heck is a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old supposed to take care of a baby? They don't even have that concept. They don't know how to do that. Like, that's craziness. On the one hand, you can say, oh, they were idle, maybe it's their peer group, but I'm like, no, for them to be impregnated, that means it has to be a person of age or of maturity enough to be able to do that. If we're not teaching our children consent, the idea of consent, and again, I'm not talking about it in a sexual manner, consent, the conversation on consent goes way beyond the true fullest extent and true understanding of consent. It goes way beyond sexual activity. Consent is simply the ability to own your bodily autonomy and to carry that sovereignty and your personhood, and know that I am allowed to say yes, and this is my body, it belongs to me. I'm allowed to say yes, I'm allowed to say no with regards to any activity that's coming towards me. If I like what's happening to me, I'm allowed to allow that to happen. If I don't like what's happening to me, I'm allowed to say, hey, stop that. That is not acceptable. Okay? Whether that's somebody simply touching me like that, somebody touching my hair, somebody like pulling on my dress, you know, all the way to like an infringement of my personal space. I'm allowed to say yes, I'm allowed to say no, and even if I had given consent before, I'm allowed to change my mind as that goes on, which brings us to the concept of, you know, continuous consent or continuous enthusiastic consent. Peep that, right? Especially as our children get older, we need to, you know, to encourage continuous enthusiastic consent, which means whatever you're consenting to, okay, you need to be doing so with the fervor and fullness of your intention. If you don't like what's happening to you in the least bit, you're allowed to step aside and say, no, this does not work for me. And that comes in friendship, in familial relationship, in acquaintances, in meeting strangers, in, you know, people who have greater position of power and authority, and when you're dealing with children, you know, when you're dealing with people of the opposite sex, when you're dealing with people of the same sex, it doesn't matter who it is, whatever the context it is. Consent looks differently depending on the context, and that's what matters. We need to encourage and to teach consent in its truest form, and understand and encourage, you know, our youngins to know, even adults, because, you know, even me, it took me a long time to get to a point where I really, you know, had a good grasp on what my bodily consent and my bodily autonomy looked like. Because especially I feel like as women, as girls, man, society conditions us to be so amenable to everybody else's desires and wants. Society conditions us to constantly put our desires and our comfort aside, right? For the betterment or for the benefit of other people. If it makes them happy, I will do these things to make other people happy, to make them happy and keep them comfortable while I'm suffering. And that's not okay. You know, it's almost like we have we are conditioned to be this constantly just sacrificing, even to our detriment. And I'm not for that. I refuse. I'm not for it. No. My sisters, my girls, if you're watching this, you are allowed to say yes when you mean yes, and you're allowed to say no when you mean no. That's how consent works across the board. Whether it's in your workplace, whether it's at church, whether it's in your own home, right? Whether you're married to that person, whether it's simply a friend, whether it's an acquaintance, whatever the relational dynamics, okay? You're allowed to say yes when you mean yes, and you're allowed to say no when you mean no, and you're allowed to change your mind, because consent is dynamic, all right? If you said yes to something 10 minutes ago and you change your mind 10 minutes later, you're allowed to update that. And ideally they must comply with that. Otherwise, then you're, in the territory of harassment and or assault. Okay? And if it encroaches into that, then absolutely please report it. If you can document it, but definitely report it. Okay? And so for me, I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, so then what does this say about us as a society? Especially for those who are immediately around these children, these girls, right? Who are pregnant, because currently we're talking just about the girls who are pregnant. Now think about it. 150,000 girls are pregnant, impregnated by some older person, man. That means these are the ones who we know because they have evidence of this abuse that has been put upon them. They're the ones who carry the evidence. What about the rest of them who didn't get pregnant? What happens to them then? They keep going, experiencing these traumatic experiences, right? Because more than likely they don't report it. Like, abuse in general is highly underreported, especially when it comes to women and girls. It's highly underreported. And so the ones who, don't carry the proof of this trauma that's been inflicted upon them, the likelihood, is very high that they're still going on experiencing these traumatic experiences. And who's there to help them? So to me, I'm like, this 150 or 4,000 machacos, this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? The true underbelly of the issue is bigger than what we really see. And man, I'm telling you, if you're watching this and you see, of these things happening, call them out. Hold them accountable. You owe them no loyalty, whether it's your friend, your cousin, your uncles, whoever, whether they're your family, your friend, doesn't matter. Hold them accountable. Period. Okay? And maybe teachers were doing something right. Whether they were teaching consent or not, sexual health or not, letting them know what the options are, if there are any options, maybe they were doing something right, in keeping the students or helping them, because man, this Rona quarantine side effect is just crazy. It's crazy. So I just wanted to kind of touch base and give us a little something to think about, mull over, as we, you know me. We talk about, equity and justice for all. And this week, especially in terms of what women need, what girls need, and the kind of life and society that we want to create for our future generations, for how we want to see society treat women and girls today, not just tomorrow, but today. How do we want our girls, because we are your sisters, we are your parents, we are your mothers, right? Your aunts, your friends, your relatives, you know, however you relate to us. It's us. If you know a woman, if you know a girl that you care about, treat every one of those girls who are going through that trauma, treat them as if you know them personally. Because that's how much it bugs me. I don't know them personally, but I'm like, man, we've dropped the ball. And I'm saying we, as a whole society, we have dropped the ball on this in holding accountable these perpetrators of such abuse to our girls and women. Because again, like I said earlier, domestic abuse, the police across the globe are seeing increased reportings of related to domestic abuse. We have to do better. We can do better. And brothers, this is for you too, right? Because you have a contextual privilege when it comes to these situations. You get to talk to your brethren when you see them, you know, having problematic ideologies, looking at girls inappropriately, approaching girls who are not of age. It's up to you, blood fam. Bro, that's not cool. Hold on to that accountable. Because, you know, y'all talk to each other differently than we talk to y'all. So it's on all of us. It's on all of us who are in a position of contextual privilege to do something about it. But otherwise, be well, take care out there, and I will see y'all.